All right, we'll give this one more minute and then we'll get started. All right, so question number 9. Oh, one person coming in now.
Yes, I got them.
Okay, we'll give them a second to get everything loaded up. So question number 9 asks, an architect is preparing a cost evaluation for a project during the programming stage. The opinion is based upon a previous similar project. Which of the following is a known factor that will add cost to the project? So this question is tricky in that all of these things are things that can add cost to a project. But we want to know which of them is known at the programming stage, and then which definitely will, not may, add cost to the project. So the correct answer here is a premium. And again, that's based on the words, you're in the programming stage, it has to be known. And I would also say, I should have underlined this, it will add cost, not may add cost. So contingencies are for unknown conditions. If you have even a 5% contingency on a project, it's to pay for unknown conditions or mistakes, change orders, and the like. It is not necessarily going to add cost to the project. It's money that you carry in your back pocket because you might have to spend it. But if you don't have to spend it, you get to keep it. It's not a problem. And this is the client who carries the contingency, not the architect, just to be very clear about that. The other two wrong answers, C and D. An additive alternate at the programming stage, it's unknown if it would be accepted. So it may add cost to the project, but we can't say for certain that it will add cost to the project. An upcharge is used to cover for unknown conditions when they're discovered. At the programming stage, you would not have discovered unknown conditions. You just have the information the client's giving you in the programming documents. So an upcharge is not something that would be charged at the programming stage. That gets charged later on if the client comes back and says, I've decided to add to the program, I've decided to change this or that about the building. That's where an upcharge is more appropriate. A premium, on the other hand, is when there's a known condition that you have to add in to make a project work. So if there is a premium present in the programming stage, that is a known condition, and that would absolutely add cost to the project. So examples of premiums or what you would charge premiums for would be a short schedule, a difficult site, or another owner requirement. I've even seen architects do premiums for difficult clients. If they have a client that's very easygoing and lets them, work peacefully and give them enough time to make a schedule, they'll give them one price. If they have another client who wants to be kept up to speed on the project every day and have a lot of conversations and be very involved, those clients sometimes get a higher price just because they take more of your time to deal with. So if they take more of your hours, they need to pay you more of the money. Any questions on contingencies, premiums, additive alternates, or upcharges? Going once, going twice. All right. So question number 10. Which of the following are included in a contractor's project overhead costs? So the keyword for this question is definitely project. All of these are examples of overhead costs: bonds and insurance, payroll taxes, office rent, permits, temporary office and sanitary facilities, and transportation expenses. They're all overhead costs, but the question wants to know which ones are assigned to a specific project. Anybody want to make a guess in the chat window? ADEC, ADEF, ADEF. All right, for the two people who had ADEF, you got it. For ADE and C, office rent is an overhead cost, but it's not assigned to a particular project. That is a general overhead cost. It doesn't mean that you don't charge for it. And if we do another session like this about practice management, office rent is an overhead cost that you have to wrap into your fees. But it's not something that you can assign to a particular project. It's assigned to all projects evenly. So general overhead costs would not count, and that's why we strike out office rent. And then project overhead costs can be attributed to one project, but they exclude labor, construction materials, and construction equipment. So payroll taxes are part of labor costs, so they would not be considered a project overhead cost. Any questions on that one? Okay. We're going to move to question 11. All right, so question 11 says, a town plans to build a small airport to provide commuter flights to the nearest metropolis. Which public works financing method will be most appropriate to use to fund the project? And the answers we have available are ad valorem tax or a property tax, a general obligation bond, a development impact fee, or a public enterprise revenue bond. Any guesses from the group on this one? And this is a question that, unless you're in a public works firm or an urban design firm, I'd say this is not a question you're going to come across very often. All right, so we have one person guessing D, and they are correct. So the other types of tax there, ad valorem taxes are property taxes. They're typically used to repay general obligation bonds. So the city can take out a general obligation bond. That's where they loan money from a financial institution, and they're going to pay it back usually by charging property tax. So if you own a home, there's a certain amount of property tax assigned to it each year based on the value of your home, and something called the millage rate. And 1 mil is 1/1000th of a cent. So knowing your millage rate and knowing the estimated value of your home, you can figure out what your property taxes for the year will be. A general obligation bond is used to fund public projects that will not produce revenue, such as schools and libraries. So since we're doing a small municipal airport that will produce revenue, so that's not the appropriate answer. A development impact fee, this is charged to developers for public improvements, such as road improvements, utility extensions, or infrastructure upgrades. So development impact fee would also not be the right answer here. If a private body were making the municipal airport and the city had to pay for a road to reach that airport, then development impact fee would be the better answer. But in this case, for the city paying for a small municipal airport, the best answer is a public enterprise revenue bond. So that funds public projects that do produce revenue. Any questions on those? Okay, we're going to move on to question number 12. All right, so this is a good one to review for South Florida. We have hydrostatic water problems all the time. So as an architect, you receive a soils report indicating the possibility of hydrostatic water problems. We've got one person asking if we can go back to question, and we'll go back in just a minute there. You're having hydrostatic water problems surrounding a basement foundation in question 12. So it asks, what construction techniques or materials should the architect consider using? Choose 4. So out of the 4 we have here, the correct answers, anybody want to make a guess to these? All right, no guesses for this one. Oh, late guess, they got it right, very good. So B, C, E, and F are the correct answers. Here's why. Damp proofing can be used below grade or above grade, but it's not effective against hydrostatic pressure, which means building paper is a great example of damp proofing. It will keep water out as long as the water has somewhere else to go. So when you have your building paper and you have rain that may get through your siding or other screen system and hit the building paper, gravity is going to pull it down, and you weep out at the bottom of your wall and you allow the moisture to escape the wall system. The building paper doesn't have to deal with water pressing against it based on its own weight. So that's what hydrostatic pressure means. It means you have standing water in the soil that is exerting pressure against your foundations. In that case, damp proofing membranes do not work. They're only for areas where you can drain the water out or where there may be a small amount of water present, but not enough to build up significant pressure on the wall system. So that's not a correct answer. Pervious paving, while it will improve drainage on the site, is going to let more water from that site get down into the area around the building, and that's actually going to increase the hydrostatic pressure underground. That's going to make the problem worse. So that one, well, it seems like an attractive answer in general, because as architects, we're always trying to handle water on site better and not have any storm water go off of our site. When it comes to hydrostatic pressure underground, pervious paving would be worse. So you would want to use solid paving or waterproof materials around the building to keep the water sheeting away from the building. So geotextiles, you can place those below soil to help direct drainage. This is basically, some of them function like a rubber sheet below the soil that will redirect drainage. Other geotextiles can be used to stabilize a hillside and give you a very steep slope, and that will help you with hydrostatic pressure. Gravel fill below a floor slab. This lets the water fall away by gravity, so it's not letting the water be held up against the bottom of your floor slab, so that will help reduce hydrostatic pressure. And positive slopes away from the building can help sheet water away from the building. That helps reduce hydrostatic pressure. And then last but not least, sump pumps can move water against gravity out to a storm drain or up to a location where they can shed away from the building, so that helps reduce the hydrostatic pressure. So there's a question in there, what are geotextiles? They are different types of fabric or plastic that you place below grade. The most common use for a geotextile is to help stabilize soil when you're building up a hill. When you build up a hill, it's built up in what are called lifts. So let me pull up a sketch here. If that was our hill, when we build this hill, if we're a contractor, we're going to build one lift of dirt at a time. So we'll build the hill up to that point and we'll compact that dirt so that we'll get this portion of the hill nice and stable so we can build the next area on top of it. Depending on the type of the soil and how well it takes to this angle of repose, we might put a layer of geotextile every 2 to 3 feet. It's essentially mesh plastic. So then we'd build up to this level, we'd fill in the soil, we'd put the geotextile on top of it, we'd come and compact all the soil below it, and this essentially just helps the hill from trying to slope and fall down as we build on top of it. This would be especially important if we had, let's say, a building foundation here. We would want to make sure that any outward pressure this building foundation is forcing on the soil can be held up, and then this soil doesn't wash out or wash away. So another thing geotextiles can help with is if you want to have planting on a very steep slope, you can add geotextiles in this direction underneath the slope. Plant roots can grow down and grab into that, and that will help stabilize the side of the hill. In this case, for drainage, we could use geotextiles that are water impervious, and we could just install them like that. So it's almost like putting a sheet of plastic below the ground, and it will help slope water away from the building out to here, and the hydrostatic pressure would have to build up and carry the water back under that geotextile membrane to let it have pressure on the building foundation. Does that answer the question? Excellent. All right, for the person who wanted to know the answers to question 9, we'll jump through each of these very quickly. So the correct answer to question 9 is a premium. The correct answer to question 10 was A, D, E, and F. Payroll taxes and office rent, neither of those count as project overhead costs. And the correct answer to question 11 was a public enterprise revenue bond, answer D. All right, so that gets us through question 12. So now let's talk about bonus question number 13. So our site is Minnesota. This is our site profile. South is to the left, north is to the right. So D is at the top of the hill, C is midway up there, or I'm sorry, on the higher end of the slope, B is on the lower end of the slope, and A is all the way down at the bottom of the slope. So the question asks, in order to take advantage of the most favorable microclimate on the site, which location should be used? Any guesses from the crowd, even though I accidentally showed the answer already? All right, one confident guess of B, another confident guess of B. Good job, everybody. So the correct answer is B. Would anybody like to guess why? Or can anybody explain their answer in the comments there? If you can, send me a short yes, and I'll know to wait for you to take a stab at explaining it. All right, Mr. Alex Betancourt, go ahead and give us your best explanation. And if you can, type in short sentences and I'll read them out loud as they go. All right, so solar heat from the south, that's correct. Less wind from the north and avoiding flooding. Those are pretty much the answers. So what we know about Minnesota, this does require you to have an idea of where all the various states are in the US. They don't tell you that you're in a northern part of the country. They do just say Minnesota. So Minnesota is up in the north. It's primarily a cold climate. The building should be sheltered from the wind. So D is a poor choice. In some climates, especially if we were in somewhere that had lots and lots of rain and heavy flooding, D would be a better choice, especially if this was a hot and humid climate. So D is very exposed to wind that comes across the top of the hill. The higher you go, the more wind speed you get. So D is not the best answer. A is down in a valley. You can get cold air collecting at the bottom of a valley. So in a cold climate, it's not always the best choice. Additionally, being at the bottom of a slope means you might be subject to flooding. So A is also not a great choice. D is most exposed to the wind. A is the one that's going to flood. So between the two of them, we know that it's going to be B or C. They both have the same kind of southern exposure, so they're not better than each other there. C is slightly higher and would be subject to higher wind speeds coming out of the south. So B is the better choice for us. Any questions on that one, or confusion about the answer, or reasoning as to why any of the other sites might be good? These are the kind of questions that I would say come most to interpretation, which makes them tricky. And again, it's very difficult as an architect to not start kind of thinking ahead of the question and saying like, well, I like B, but I could make C work if I built some kind of shelter around it, or if I was allowed to do this, or maybe I could cut C into the hill and that would help protect it. Try not to think like that too much. Try to just take, okay, this is the very simple facts the question gave me, and this is the best answer I can get. So we went through the questions faster than I usually do in a live session. In a live session, I think I do a little bit more sketching on a whiteboard, and I also get a little bit more feedback back and forth from the group. It's a little bit trickier when you guys are limited to the chat window, but I appreciate everybody keeping their mics muted and their cameras off to make sure everything goes smoothly. We can take additional questions at this point. We can also, if there's any questions about any portion of this whole presentation that's put together, We cover building context, codes and regulations, site analysis, building analysis, and selection of structural systems, which we didn't have any questions on. So if anybody wants to have any of those reviewed or review another question or just send out a general question, happy to answer it and hang around for the next 40 minutes.
Or perhaps a separate division, if anybody has a question on that. I know this Griffin's presentation includes all divisions. Okay, structural systems. I think Lorena wants to touch on that.
Okay. There's one question before that. In what climate types would the other locations on the hill be desirable? So I'm going to jump down to site analysis, which I think is somewhere in the 60s for these slides. There's codes and regulations. Okay, so the first couple slides for site analysis go through the solar orientation. And then we look at the climate regions. This is Minnesota for the record. So we have those as broken down roughly, and then broken down more specifically into the climate zones 1 through 8. It's good to know what those are. It's also good to know that we are the only part of the continental United States that gets to be in the dark red #1 zone. So go South Florida, being unique. All right, so design responses are listed out here. So to answer what types of climates the hill would be desirable for. So for cold climates, you want to do compact forms, large south-facing windows, interior material with high thermal mass, summer shading, dark color for exterior, and shield the building from the winds. So that's not good for the hill, as we saw in the question. For temperate climates, you want summer shade and winter exposure so that you pick up the sunlight in the winter. Again, south-facing windows. Use the wind to your advantage in the summer and block the wind during winter. So this would be a decent answer for being up on the top of the hill. It's the best place to get out of the any flood areas, so it keeps you high. If you can use your wind to the advantage in the summer, it's difficult to block the wind during the winter there, so it has a little bit of variability to it. But if you're in a temperate climate, such as anywhere in this yellow or portions of the orange band, a hilltop would be better. And then if we look at hot, humid climates, you want shade for all the openings. You want to maximize natural ventilations and light colors on the exterior. So this one, the hilltop, is definitely a good answer. Just as a heads up, and I'm sure you guys already know this, being in Miami, climate is difficult to design for comfort without relying on mechanical cooling. For hot, arid climates, the valley might be more valuable to you there than getting the wind exposure on top of the hill. I would say that one depends on what the rest of the site looks like, although with only the information that's given, I would be tempted to go with the valley there. All right, so the next question we had was, can we touch on structural systems? And then to look through the other ones, could you email this presentation? Yes, I'll get all of you a copy or a link to this. How were you able to pass the exams in 6 months? What study materials did you use and strategies? And then what is a solar house? So I'm going to answer those in the order they came up. So let's touch on structural systems first. All right, so selection of structural systems. So I'm just going to very quickly jump through each of these slides. There are, let's see, that starts on slide number 127 and goes down to slide it goes to about here, complex structural systems and selection criteria. There's about 50 questions there, and then it goes into a sample exam part 1. So if we look at structural system selection criteria first, so your primary consideration always is resistance to the loading. A secondary consideration would be the building use and the function. So like for a parking garage, you need a long span, you need materials that are going to stand up to the outdoors. So a steel parking garage doesn't always make as much sense as concrete. Concrete stands up better to the elements than steel does. And that counts for if you're in South Florida, concrete stands up better because it has better salt resistance. If you're in the north, I'm personally from Ohio, we would still use concrete because you have to salt any ice that develops in the garage, and you don't want to cast salt onto any steel, even if you've got your steel covered over with paint. So it is exterior rated. Getting salt on it is going to make it rust faster. Another thing to take into account is what kind of spans you want to look for. So some concrete systems span about 20 feet easily. Some steel systems span up to 60 to 90 feet easily, depending on how deep you're going to go with your structural, how much allowance you give for structural depth. So knowing off the top of your head that something like an office building works well with spans of 30 to 40 feet will help you figure out what's the best answer there. So both concrete and steel can span 30 to 40 feet. Either one of those would work. Wood is less likely to work for an office building, and something like a two-way slab in concrete is less likely to be a great option for an office building. Other requirements that you might have in building use and function: laboratories need to be very rigid, especially if you're doing something like physics studies there, so you don't have any vibration. Some of them, if you were studying electromagnetism, right, like concrete might be a better answer than steel. And then they might need significant plenum depths if they're going to have a lot of HVAC hoods that exhaust out and keep dangerous chemicals from circulating inside the building. It's always good to integrate the structural selection with the other building systems. Do keep in mind, again, for the AREs, only use the facts that they give you in the question. So if they ask you to select a structural system for a parking garage, right, you can assume that it's just a parking garage, that it doesn't need any additional things added to it, that you're not going to have maybe, MEP services run in that parking garage, right? That wouldn't be typical. The question didn't say it, so you can ignore it completely. But things that you would want to include: MEP floor penetrations. These can be flexible and steel structures if you're doing something like a two-way post-tension concrete slab or even a one-way. It's much more difficult to coordinate where the MEP openings go with the post-tensions. The wires in the floor, you can't cut a hole through those, obviously, so it's a little bit more difficult to design your MEP system. Pre-stressed concrete as well needs more design consideration. And then if you're going to do anything that's exposed structure, steel or wood, or exposed architectural concrete, making sure that you conceal the MEP and make everything work with that is an additional challenge. When it comes to cost, there's the structural system efficiency and then the arrangement. So how efficient it is basically how many pieces of it do you need to have. So you have to satisfy the loading, the aesthetics, and the fire rating. And then the system arrangement is, if you're doing let's say you're doing preformed concrete, the more you can make that repetitive for the contractor to build, the more you can keep the formwork regular. If you're doing cast in place, the cheaper and easier it is for them to build. Steel too, the more regular you can make it, the easier it is for the contractor. When those beams come to site, they're all going to be put basically in a staging area for the contractor, and they're going to have to tag all of those pieces of structure that come on site with where they go. If all the pieces are identical, it's much quicker for them to sort through and find a piece that satisfies the conditions to put in the right place. If they're all unique, then it's much more difficult. Fire resistance is a good one to review. Wood framing can burn. Steel gets weak at high heat, so it's not a great choice for fire resistance unless you're going to fireproof it. Heavy timber, which is considered different from wood framing, forms a char layer. If you've ever sat around a campfire in the evening and you've had a log that sits in the fire long enough, it starts to go out, and you can poke it with a stick and break off that char layer, and then the flames spring back up. So this is true for heavy timber. It's actually one of the best structures for fire. Concrete would be the best. Masonry is a close second. Heavy timber is kind of third. It's better than steel when it comes to standing up in high heat. Steel doesn't burn, but when you heat it up enough, it becomes ductile, which means it will bend. And once it bends and starts deforming, that's where that structure starts to fail. And 2 more slides here to go through for structural system selection. Think about the construction time, because the faster you can get that building built and occupied from the start day of construction, the faster it starts making money and the easier it is for the developer or the investors to get their money back and start paying off their financing costs. It also relieves labor costs, so it makes things just, the faster you can build it, the cheaper it is to build. And then material and labor are the primary costs. In the US, labor is expensive and material is relatively cheap. In other places, you may find that labor is cheap and materials will be more expensive. This is especially true if you work on a project that's in a very remote location or an island project. I know I've worked on one project that was in Jamaica, and shipping steel or other items to the island is expensive, but they have both aluminum deposits and a decent amount of concrete that's available. So it's just faster and easier to build out of those materials because they're more available. So whenever you start a project, if it's not an area you're familiar with, those are two things to look into very quickly. What material is plentiful and available, and then what is the labor cost, and does it make more sense for you to make sure that you spend less on material or less on labor? Workforce skills, these are another big important part. If you're in Ohio, you're gonna find more steel workers. If you're in South Florida, you're gonna find more concrete workers. So the local contractors are gonna have a set of skills that you want to work with. If you have a building that demands a specific type of structure, you can always get experts brought in. It's just going to add cost to the project, and that's something to keep an eye on. Social, cultural, and historical influences can change system selection. If you're in a town that's all wood framing and it's a small town and that's a part of their heritage and their pride, they may insist that you do wood framing. Or as a culturally sensitive architect, you might want to use the systems that are available to you there so that you don't disturb the urban fabric. And then the last item there is equipment and staging. So a good example of this is if you're going to do a building in downtown New York, it's probably going to have to be a tall building to make the investment make sense, because you need to have a lot of density because land's very expensive there. But one of the big challenges is where are you going to put your construction crane and how does everything work around that crane? This is true for most urban sites. If you're going tall, where the crane goes and how you can build the building and keep that crane on site and have that crane build its way up and then drop back down when you're done is always a challenge. There are cranes that build themselves essentially as elevator shafts. And when you get to the top of the building and you've topped out, the crane is disassembled on the roof and then dropped back down the elevator shaft, which is a pretty cool process to see. So that's a very broad, very fast-paced review of structural systems. The presentation does have a lot of the other structural systems described here. So complex, truss, non-load bearing walls, composite constructions, masonry. If you have any questions on masonry or haven't worked on it, highly recommend looking at the Masonry Detailing series from IMI.web. This is the International Masonry Institute. And especially if you're doing a building, all of these show insulation on the outside, which is one thing you wouldn't do in Florida, but they show you how the ladder ties work, how the brick ties work to tie your CMU wall to your brick facing, where your insulation goes in a cold climate. So in Florida, we'd put the insulation on the other side. But especially, this is a great example of, if you've never done a masonry sill detail, this kind of outlines, this is how the whole system works. This is what you should see, especially if you're getting to the point in your career where you might be going to site. And if you're going to work on a building like this, again, highly recommend study these details. So when you go on site, you can make sure the right things are being installed. Other structural systems, just to go through everything we had. Concrete, both post-tensioned and pre-stressed. Since we're in Florida, I would say definitely get familiar with those for just your own career. Precast concrete structures, cast in place concrete structures, two-way systems, one-way systems, steel structure, and wood structure. And I think we're going to get close to the beginning here. There we go. Okay. So that touches on structural systems. Yes, we will email the presentation. For passing the exams in 6 months. So I passed under ARE 4.0, which was the system before this. I took one exam in, I think, August, and then I allowed a month before my second exam, and then I started just trying to take them once every 2 weeks. I did end up having one failure, the last one I took, so I had to wait 90 days and then retake that, and I passed it on the second go around. I did wait until I was 5 years out of school, and I had a fair amount of experience under my belt to get that done. I also will say that I had really good mentors and job opportunities along the way. It helps a lot to have a good project manager on your side who will help you get your construction hours accurately and really take you to site and kind of walk you through everything, and not just take you to site and have you sit at a round table construction meeting and say like, okay, log this as site observation because you were here on the site. To me, there's pressure to get your NCARB hours done, but site observation should be walking the site, talking to the GC and the subs, learning more about what you know and what you don't know, and what you should be looking for when you're on the site and you're doing construction. Another thing that really helped me was that I renovated a house in the first couple of years of being out of college. I happened to, again, this is more luck and opportunity than anything else. And since I lived in Ohio, home prices are much, much less than what they are in Florida. But we happened into a house that was a pretty low cost because it was beat up. We bought it, flipped it, and just doing all of that construction makes you look up all the details that you think you knew, or the things that you would expect to have learned in school as an architect, and realize how little you actually knew, or you knew a bit about it, but you didn't know everything. So I'd say anywhere you can get yourself involved in construction, it makes things easier. Get enough job experience that you feel confident when you take the exams. I know a lot of times people will encourage you, like, as soon as you get out of school, start getting ready and studying for your exams. I think there is a big value to getting the job experience though. So I don't encourage anybody to try and pass the exams in the first 6 months out of school. Even having had 5 years experience out of school, the day after I got my license, my boss at the firm that I worked at joked with me, which project do you want to stamp this week? Because we have 3 going out. And I realized that I had my stamp, but I would not have felt comfortable reviewing a project yet and not having a more experienced project manager sit with me and review it. So in my opinion, there's no rush to get licensed. There is usually a salary bump that comes with it, and it is kind of the culmination of your education and training as an architect. It's when you get to take that step into the profession and you've really arrived. But don't rush it just to get the stamp, right? The stamp is useless if you're not confident using it. And so I guess that's all I'll say on that. The study materials I used were the Kaplan and Ballast books. I also downloaded a set of flashcards. The flashcards were from a group called NALSA, N-A-L-S-A. Let me see if they still exist. I'll say the flashcards were helpful it looks like they're closed for the moment. There's a number of places where you can find little flashcard programs that you can either program in yourself, or they'll come pre-fitted with a bunch of ARE questions on them. They're really useful for questions where you have to memorize things, like how high you can use an upfeed water system. They're not as useful for questions where you have to reason things out. For those, you just have to get used to understanding the logic behind everything. So that's all I'm going to say about that question. Next question, what is a solar house? So a solar house would be a house that primarily focuses on using the sun or energy available in the natural environment. It's not that different from a greenhouse. At least that's what I believe a solar house is. There might be a more specific definition. I've always heard solar houses, again, I have a lot of experience in Ohio, more than I have in Florida, but a solar house there would be one that has solar panels and uses proper orientation to take advantage of heating in the winter months. If there's more clarification to that question or context, I'll let you know if I think there's anything further on it. Next question is from Eduardo, and it says, would you say that you need to know a lot of structural formulas for this exam, or just general concepts? For programming and analysis, it should be primarily general concepts. There are other exams where you need to know the formulas and have a better understanding of how they work. That aside, I would also say that there are very few architects who remember and use those formulas off the top of their heads. There are you can get access to like good little cheat sheets that will tell you that if you have X amount of feet of span, then you should use L over 20 or L over 12 to determine the approximate structural depth. Again, in my experience, not a lot of architects take that into account when they're in early SD, right? We're all trying to make the building look beautiful, and we're going to make it the structural engineer's headache on the back end to help us figure out how to actually support that 6-inch concrete eyebrow that we've designed that's supposed to hold up, a balcony and be cantilevered 30 feet off the building. My opinion, and again, this is just me personally, I like to go to my structural engineers with an idea of the systems that I'm using and an accurate sense of how deep they can be. So I do encourage people to learn more about structures. I think it's one of the places where young designers tend to be the weakest because it's not focused on as much in school, at least at most universities that I've been at. So we just don't get as much training or as much emphasis on it. But I do encourage people, like, the more you learn about structure, the more informed conversations you can have with your structural engineer, and you can make things work that they might not have thought of. So the more formulas you know and you understand, the better off you are. But for this particular exam, it's less critical to know the formulas. For exams 4 and 5, PPD and PDD, I think that's where those formulas come into more use. Manny asks, suggestions or tips to pass the case studies. On the case studies, so that is one part that I never had to do personally under the ARE 4.0. I know the Young Architects Forum in Miami might have better experienced people who can give you answers on this. I'd say whenever there's a complex question, take an outline of notes when you're reading through the question so you can write down what seems to be the critical information. When we had complex questions on 4.0, I would quickly read through the question and then quickly read through the answers. Not kind of getting into a deep dive, but let me pull the examples back up real quick here and I'll show you the things I would watch out for. If we look at question number 7. So question number 7 has a short question and then it has a bunch of long answers, right? So if I would look at this, I would say, okay, so I want to know about cost opinions, which one's going to have the highest contingency. And then I would quickly read these, not thinking critically through the answers and just trying to figure out what things are different between the 4 answers. So they always change just before the drawings are sent. Conclusion of design development, conclusion of schematic, prepared during programming phase. Time is always changed, and then program is always changed. Small vet clinic, building designed by the architect 2 years ago, old warehouse into artist studios, or new elementary school. The differences in time are going to have a bigger effect on the contingency than the differences in program. So at this point, I would say to myself, okay, so if I'm looking at contingency allowance, ignore the program stuff. That's just additional information that's not going to affect the answer. So that's one way to look through something complex. Another example would be question 5 kind of gives you a lot of important information that's going to be used. Let me see if there's another good example. I thought I had one that had more kind of unnecessary information in the question.
I would add, Griffin, for the ARE 5.0, for the case studies, I think a good method is to become very familiar with the resources available during the case studies, because they give references, they give the IBC, the International Building Code. So learning to navigate those rather quickly to know where some of the references can be found, the different sections of the code, can help you find the answers you need.
Excellent point. So yeah, strategies I've read, just kind of quickly go through everything on like a first pass and make sure you understand what the questions are asking and what answers are available and see if those give you any clues. And then definitely look through the reference material and make sure you use the stuff that's relevant. I know at least under 4.0, there was at least 2 times when I was looking in the reference material for one thing and found a direct answer to a different question on the exam. So every once in a while, you get a nice little freebie like that. Juan asks, will there be more sections like this? Do you mean will there be more review presentations? Or do you mean will there be more sections that are similar to programming and analysis?
Well, there will definitely be more ARE sessions.
Okay.
Review presentations, yes.
I'll help out as much as I can over the next couple months. I'm the president of AIA Fort Lauderdale, so I'm going to be pretty focused on our things. We have to have our annual meeting is in 2 weeks. Our design awards are in November. There's a number of other little events that we have in between that we've got to get sorted out. So everything's always a moving target right now too, with quarantine and what we can do and what we can't do.
Yes, there's definitely planning to be done, but we do hope to have a session on the different divisions, and if Griffin can grace us with his presence again, since he explains, so clearly to everyone, we will definitely do these again. It was a great turnout.
Before we get wrapped up, if anybody has any suggestions for ways this could be better, or if there were, like if you wanted to see questions that involved more sketching or ways we could make the presentation better or more interactive. Again, I'm used to doing these in person and I get a fair amount of interaction there. Having everybody remote and just typing into the chat, I think limits how much feedback people are willing to give. So please leave us honest feedback. If you think it was great, thanks a lot. If you think it sucked, let me know. Or if you have an idea about how it can be improved, always open to constructive criticism. All right, I believe I can, Sarah, if it's okay with you, I'm going to end the recording at this point.
Yes, that's fine. And the recording and the presentation will be made available to everyone. We will have Colleen from the AIA share the information with everyone. So thank you, Griffin. And thank you, everyone, for joining.